server because we get back the object. Hopefully the basics are clear, and now we can start expanding on our knowledge. All right, we're done with the basics, but there are two major issues with our current setup. First of all, we don't provide any info about the data that we're sending back. So we don't have any metadata about the body that we're sending out. So we're not providing any information. We just go res.end and then pass in the string. So that's issue number one. And then issue number two, if I were to go to the localhost 5000, and if I type about, or if I type contact or whatever, you'll see that, of course, we're sending back the same response each and every time. So if we go with contact, again, this is going to be a homepage. So why don't we deal with issue number one first, where we provide more info to the browser of what we're actually sending back. And then in the next video, we'll deal with the request. And the way we provide more info, we just need to add more methods. Now, specifically one more method, and that is going to be res.writeHead. And in there, you can probably already guess that we're just providing headers. So we're providing metadata about our response. And we go here with res dot, and then we go with write head. So write head. And then we need to provide a few things. We start with a status code, and I'll talk about the status code in a second. And for time being, I'll just pass in 200, which just means that the request was successful. And then we pass in the headers. And one of the most common headers is the content type. So this is where I specifically say to the browser, hey, listen, I'm sending back HTML, or I'm sending back CSS, or I'm sending back the image. So browser knows, well, what to do, how to render that content. And like I mentioned already previously, this is done using key value pairs. So we go with content type. So that's the name of the header. And then we pass in text. And then if, for example, I want to pass in the HTML, I go with text / and then HTML. And now, of course, in this case, where I have the res.end, I can set up the HTML. So for example, I could go with heading 1, and I'll say homepage. Same deal, homepage. Now, if you want, you can keep it this way, where you have res.end and you directly pass in the HTML. However, I like to use better this approach, where I go with res.write, and we do the same thing. We pass in essentially the body, and I set up my HTML here in the right, or any content that I'm sending back, and then explicitly call res.end. Again, if you want, you can pass this heading 1 into the end. Just make sure that you have the end. And you saw that in a docs, where it says if data is specified, it is similar effect to calling response.write, and then we pass in the data followed by res.end. But you always need to call res.end. So this is really up to you. If you want, you can pass this directly into res.end. I like to write it a bit explicitly, where I say res.write. So that is my body. And then I just end the communication by calling res.end. And now, of course, if I go back to the browser, again, I'll still have the same issue, where it's going to be displayed for every request, meaning either contact page, homepage, or whatever. But now I provide way more useful info to the browser, where browser knows, hey, I'm getting back the HTML, so I'll need to render HTML. And this stuff matters. So let me show you. If I change the content type back, for example, to plain, and if I save and if you refresh, now notice this is now treated as a text. It's not treated as HTML. So whatever you set up over here in the content type, yes, it does matter. Now Express takes care of that, so we won't have to do that. But I just want to let you know that if you will be setting up the headers yourself, yes, the stuff that you type here matters. And as a side note, it is also called MIME type, or you can think of it as media type. So whatever we're sending back. And now let's go over the status codes as well as other options for MIME types. And this is where I would like to introduce an awesome resource for anything HTTP related, and that is going to be no other than the Mozilla docs. So if you go to HTTP and status codes, you'll see probably the first link is going to be to the MDN. And as you can see, HTTP response status codes indicate whether specific HTTP request has been successfully completed. And like I mentioned before, there are quite a few groups over here and there are quite a few codes, but I would strongly discourage you from spending your weekend on memorizing the codes. As we're going to be progressing with the course, as we're going to be creating more complex applications, of course, we'll introduce more and more status codes. But the main idea is following, where when we send back the response, I'm just saying, is it successful? Maybe the resource wasn't available, so then I send back 404, or maybe there was a bad request. That's why there's also option 400. And hopefully you get an idea where we are setting up that status code so the browser knows what is happening with the request. Was it successful? Was there an error? Maybe, I don't know, you're not authorized to access it, and on and on and on. And if you keep on scrolling, notice, so the 100 ones are going to be informational responses. Then for successful one, we have 200. So that probably is going to be the one that you'll use the most. So that means that request has succeeded. Then we have 201, also something that we'll use throughout the course a lot. And this one is once the post request is successful. So if you add the resource successfully onto the server, then you just send back 201. We have 300s for redirect. And then these are the ones that you probably don't want to get if you are surfing the web. So 400 is for bad request. So for example, you are requesting some kind of data or you're trying to do something with the server, but you don't provide the info. So I don't know, I'm trying to add the user, but I don't provide the username, something along those lines. Then 401 is for unauthorized, then 403 forbidden, and 404 not found. So in our case, we'll set up a response if the user is trying to access the resource that does not exist. So hopefully it is clear. That is the status code. Again, I wouldn't suggest memorizing it as we are moving along with the course. Of course, we'll cover more status codes. Just understand the main idea, where you attach that status code to let the browser know, hey, what's happening. And it is very important that you use the correct status codes because we are in charge here. Nothing stops me from sending back the 404 here, meaning the resource is not found. And then when you navigate to the contact page, for example, here, and if you inspect again the browser network tab, you'll see this confusing info where 404 is technically not found, right? But at the same time, we are sending back the correct resource. So yes, whatever we type as far as the status code, it does matter. It's not just some random info, and that just reflects what is happening with the request. And then lastly, let's talk about MIME types. Same deal. Just go to your favorite search engine and just type MIME and types. And again, I suggest using the MDN, and these are just going to be media types. So whatever we're sending back, there's quite a few out there. Now again, Express takes care of that, so we don't need to worry about it. But if you ever need to set it up, I don't suggest memorizing them. The ones that you'll need to use, you'll pretty much be able to Google it right away. You can also use the NPM packages. So no, you don't need to go and memorize them. Again, just remember the main idea where you're sending back something, right? And you need to describe to the browser, well, what are you sending back? Are you sending back the image? Are you sending back CSS? Are you sending back the HTML? And as you saw in a previous example, if you change that MIME type, if you change that content type header, yes, the browser will interpret that differently. And once we successfully have set up more proper response, now let's start dealing with the request object. Beautiful. And with our basic headers in place, now let's deal with the request object. And like I already previously mentioned, it's just a giant object. And if, of course, we console log it, then we'll see it in a terminal. So I'm going to go back to my local host 5000. And as a side note, this is getting quite busy. So I can just remove some of the tabs. And if I just refresh the browser, I should see in a terminal a giant object. So what are we looking for? Well, let's go back to our slide and remember the start line. We had a method. So that signals what the user is trying to do, either get the resource, post the resource, or whatever. And then we have the URL. Now, in order to save us a little bit of time, I won't cover the methods with HTTP. We'll just deal with the URL. But we will cover, of course, methods once we hit the Express. For now, I'm just going to assume that the only thing that the users are trying to do, they just want to get the resources from our server. So that's why we won't look for the method. Just keep in mind that, yes, of course, those methods are available on this request object. There's a property by the name of, I believe it was just simply method. So if we console log and if I refresh, notice here in a terminal, it says get. So the user is performing a get request. So the user is trying to get the resource. So that's one thing that we could take a look at. And the other one is actually the URL. So let me uncomment this one. And I'm looking for the URL property. And again, I refresh. And now in the console, I should have this /contact. So that just means that the user is trying to access the resource by the name of contact. And if, of course, the resource is there, awesome, we send something back. If not, then most likely we would send back the 404. Now, if I delete that contact and if I simply go with 5000, notice I'm going to have the /. So again, this just signals that we're getting the homepage. So / is going to be the homepage. And then whatever other resource we would want, we would have / and then the resource. Now, sometimes those resources are going to be / resource name, and then another / and another resource name, and on and on and on. You can really type here whatever you'd want. So again, I go with localhost, about, and then info, and I don't know, something John, right? So I can add that here, and there it is. Now I'm requesting this resource. And if it's not there, we send back 404. If it's there, then of course, we send back the useful info. So hopefully that is clear. Yes, this will just mean that it is a homepage, and whatever comes after the homepage, well, that's the resource that the user is trying to access. And now, of course, we can set up the if statement where I say, yes, if it is a homepage, please send back this HTML. If it is about page, then send something else. And then if I cannot find that resource that you're looking for, then we'll send back 404. Now, there's going to be a little bit of copying and pasting just so we can save a little bit of time. We're just going to go with if, and actually we can set this up as a property. So let's go with const URL is equal to request URL. And then we'll say if URL is equal to /. What does that mean? Well, that means that it is a homepage. So let's grab these 3 lines of code and move them up. And now, of course, I would want to set up else if. Now, I'll just set up one for the about page. So if URL is equal to about page, then we'll do something else. And if none of those match, well, then I'll just say else, and I'll send back 404. Now, I will add some comments here just so we are clear of what is happening. So this is going to be about page. Then this is going to be called homepage, and then we're going to have the 404. So resource not found. So again, in order to save us a little bit of time, let's just copy and paste 1 and 2. And again, content type will be exactly the same. So that is going to be HTML because we'll send back the HTML. I'll say about, and I don't know, page, let's call that. And then the last one is going to be the 404. So in here, of course, we're not going to send back 200. 200 is for successful request. Now, of course, I want to say, hey, listen, the resource that you're trying to access, well, it doesn't exist on my server. So here I go with 404. And again, I go with the same content type, text HTML, and then let's just send back the heading 1 with page not found. So save this one. And now, of course, once I refresh, check it out. I get this page not found. Why? Well, because there's no resource / about info and John. But if I go to just about, there it is. Now, of course, I have my about page. And then if I go back to the home page, of course, I have heading 1 with a home page. Now, we optionally, if we want, we can add the status text as well. And in order to see that, let's just go back to the node docs. So this is going to be the HTTP. And of course, I'm looking for right head. And we have a right head here. Notice we have status code. Optionally, we can pass in status message. And then we have the headers. So again, let's go back to our slide. This is the most important one, status code. And then the status text essentially is just going to be added. In this case, we don't need to do anything. Because again, if we were to go back to the browser network tab, and if we take a look at our local host, there is, first of all, this is /. That just means that we're going to the homepage and the status code is 200. And then we have this status text. Now, again, if I navigate to a page that doesn't exist, for example, John, then of course I'm going to get the 404. So that's the status code. And then the status text is not found. So hopefully it is clear. Now we have a bit more meaningful server where we have multiple resources. We have homepage, we have the about page, and also we have the error page. And with this in place, now of course we can start working on more complex setup. Nice. And with our most basic example in place, now I'm going to start throwing mind grenades at you. First of all, I want to let you know that, of course, we're not limited to passing in the HTML directly into the .right or .end. Meaning, imagine if you would have to every time just set it up or your HTML in methods directly. Of course, what we can do instead is set up the file, then require the file using the file system, and then just pass it in. Now, keep in mind one thing though, where we will be passing in the contents of the file, not the file itself. Again, that's very important. We'll be passing in the contents of the file. So that means we still need to use this content type. Just because we're going to be getting the data from the HTML file doesn't really mean anything. Yes, it's nice. It's going to make our lives easier if you want to set up a more meaningful web page, but we still need to set up the content type. Now, this is going to be a temporary file because in the next video, we'll cover a more serious example. And I already prepared all the files for you. So this is where we'll really struggle. And this is where I'll show you why we use the Express. But for now, if you want to follow along, just create a simple index.html or about HTML. Doesn't really matter how you call the file in the folder. Again, this is really optional. I'm going to go with new file and I'm going to call this index.html. And again, the whole reason why I'm doing that because I want to set up a more proper page and I don't want to type everything here in the right or end. I mean, it's much more nicer here, right? So I'm just going to go with Emmet setup in Visual Studio Code. I get my basics and I can say homepage, and then I'm just going to go with a heading 4 of Hello World. Again, this is just to showcase that sky's the limit. Just like you normally would set up the HTML, you can do exactly the same thing. And then I'm going to go back to app.js. And first of all, I'm going to get the read file. So I'm going to go with const and then read file and sync. And I'm going to talk about why I'm using the sync in a second. So don't freak out. I know I mentioned before that we need to be mindful of the methods that we use, that there is a difference between the blocking and non-blocking. And I'm just going to go with FS over here. And we need to come up with some kind of name. And again, in the next video, there's going to be more data here. So that's why I'll say get all files. For the time being in this video, I'll just get one. And I'm going to call this homepage. Again, call it whatever you would want. You can call this Bobby Lee. Doesn't really matter. It's just a variable. And we're going to go with read, file, and sync. And of course, where's the file? It is in the same folder. So we go with relative path. And I'm just going to call this index.html. Now, again, we're getting the contents. Now, why I'm using here the read file sync? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, we need to keep in mind that we're not invoking this every time someone comes to the server. Please keep in mind that we require that file when we instantiate our server. So basically that initial time when the server starts running. So it's not like when the request comes in, then again, every time we're requesting the file. Yes, of course, if I were to place this in the if block, yeah, that's a different scenario. Meaning if I were to even place this in a create server, again, same scenario, but not in here. Again, we're just requesting this once. That's the first reason why I went with that. And second, it's just an example. So I want to make my life a little bit easier. What I want to focus on is something else. With this homepage in place, now, of course, what I would want is to go back to my if where I'm checking for the homepage. And instead of going with res.write and then typing it out, we're just going to go with our contents. Now, again, we're still keeping this one, the text HTML, and I'll show you in a second what happens if we change it to a text plain. And now we go with a homepage. And now be prepared to be amazed, because if I go to not John, that resource, of course, doesn't exist. There it is. Check it out. We have homepage as well as the hello world. So we can start making some meaningful HTML pages and we can serve them with our awesome server. And just to re-emphasize my point, if we change this to a plain and save and refresh, now, of course, we're getting a text. So yes, it is very important of what content type we are setting up. So let's go back to HTML. And now, of course, we are in good shape. Awesome. We have our homepage. And now, of course, I can go to index.html